The later prehistory of Britain, spanning roughly from 2500 BC to the Roman conquest in AD 43, was a period of profound social, technological, and cultural transformation. It begins with the waning of Neolithic monument building and the adoption of metalworking, as communities across the archipelago discovered how to extract and alloy copper and tin to create bronze. This innovation revolutionized tools, weapons, and ornaments, enabling more efficient farming implements and more formidable axes and swords, and fostering long-distance trade networks that linked Britain with continental Europe. By the Middle Bronze Age from 1500 to 1000 BC, metalworking techniques had matured, and regional identities began to emerge, expressed through distinct pottery styles, burial rites, and settlement patterns. Roundhouses became commonplace, often clustered within defended farmsteads or hilltop enclosures. Funerary practices diversified. Some communities favored earthwork barrows for their chieftains, while others practiced cremation, depositing ashes in urns within communal cemeteries. The transition to the Iron Age 800 BC introduced a new material, iron, which, though more difficult to smelt, offered greater abundance and durability. Iron Age societies in Britain developed increasingly complex hierarchical structures. Hill forts, some sprawling over hundreds of acres, others more modest in scale, served as communal refuges, craft centers, and symbols of elite power. Within their ramparts, evidence of specialized metalworking, textile production, and intensive agriculture points to growing social stratification. Artistic expression flourished in the Latin style, characterized by flowing curvilinear motifs on metalwork and imported luxury goods. Meanwhile, Druids and other ritual specialists likely oversaw religious observances at sacred groves and spring sites, leaving no written records but inspiring later classical accounts. By the 1st century BC, intensified contacts with the Roman world introduced Mediterranean influences, coinage, fine pottery, exotic goods, further reshaping local economies and elite identities. As military incursions ultimately culminated in Claudian conquest, Britain's later prehistory closed, yielding to a new chapter in its history yet leaving enduring legacies in its landscapes, monuments, and material culture.
Hello, my name is Duncan Garrow and I'm Professor of Later Prehistoric Archaeology here at the University of Reading. I've been in Reading for 12 years now, and before that I worked at the University of Liverpool. And I did various things before that, including working in developer-funded archaeology for about 5 years, where I learned a lot about excavation practice and a lot about all sorts of different sites and ways of thinking about them and how to dig them, which was immensely important in my past, I would say, and has let me carry on doing excavation since. Originally, that work led into my PhD, and digging sites. We encountered a lot of pits in the archaeological record of all sorts of different sizes and ages, and so I ended up doing my PhD on Neolithic and early Bronze Age pits, which are in a way bigger than they sound because they represent prehistoric settlement of that period, especially in East Anglia where that was focused. And so one of the themes that's kind of continued through the whole of my work that I'm still working on today is the idea of ritual deposition in pits, but also subsequently well beyond that in all sorts of different contexts, including hoards and graves with burials, and most recently in lochs or lakes around Neolithic Crannog settlements. One of the main projects that I've worked on over the past 10 and more years is focused on islands with my good friend and colleague Fraser Sturt at the University of Southampton. We've had a couple of projects, one looking at early Neolithic settlement on islands around Britain. So we worked in Guernsey, in the island of South Uist in the Outer Hebrides, and on the Isles of Scilly, and we were digging settlement sites and finding out about the earliest kind of maritime connections at that time. And that has led into a project which has looked at crannogs, so artificial islands in lakes or lochs, and we've been focusing particularly on a new, very early kind of crannog which date to the Neolithic. So we've been working in the Isle of Lewis, and we've also been working right across the Outer Hebrides in North Uist, South Uist and Benbecula as well. We've dug really fantastic sites which have involved preserved 5,000-6,000 year old wooden layers, where lots of fantastic, beautifully decorated pots have been deposited into the lochs around these sites, and we've encountered some amazing archaeology. We've also done some surveys all across Uist in different lochs. We haven't met any monsters yet, but we have found lots of pottery dating to all sorts of different periods, including some new Neolithic sites. That's been an amazing project to be involved with, and we're writing that up now. As well as that, probably the main project that I've been involved with has been a project looking at later prehistoric grave goods with my colleagues Mel Giles and Neil Wilkin. And in that project we investigated grave goods, as you might imagine, and tried to look at what people placed in graves with the dead throughout the Neolithic, Bronze Age and Iron Age, but not just looking at the fancy, spectacular grave goods, which are often the focus of archaeological accounts and of museum displays and things like that, but the everyday, small, maybe emotionally meaningful objects, little things such as pebbles and just single pots and things like that went in graves. And we found out lots of stuff, and that was a fun project to be involved with. And that led into my work with Neil at the British Museum on the World of Stonehenge exhibition, which was a major temporary exhibition for 6 months in 2022, where we brought lots of artefacts dating from the Mesolithic through to the end of the Bronze Age, which kind of occupied Europe at the time of Stonehenge. They were the world of Stonehenge. And again, in that exhibition, we had some really spectacular objects, the Nebra sky disc, the Mould Gold Cape, and many other amazing things. But alongside those, we tried to foreground the less fantastic ones, the less sparkly, the less gold. So we included organic objects, and one of the most popular was a single elm leaf that was almost 6,000 years old, but really captured the imagination. And we were able to evaluate and gauge what the public thought of that exhibition because of a funded project around that. Within my work, since the very beginning, I've looked at settlements that people were living on in various different ways, and tried to really push the boundaries and find out what you can actually tell from the sometimes really small-scale archaeological remains that are left. So looking at the number of pots in a pit to try and find out how long people might have been living on that site, through to thinking about, on the crannogs that we've been looking at, the kind of food they might have been eating. And so I've been working with Lucy Cramp in Bristol, and together we are working with a fantastic PhD student, Dan Brown, who's been sampling the residues left in all the pots that have been deposited into the lochs or lakes around these sites. And Dan's been able to show that different kinds of food were prepared in different kinds of pot. So the type of pot determine the kind of food that people ate in it, and that's been a really fantastic thing to discover. Unfortunately, we don't have any bones because the acidic soils don't preserve them, but we are also attempting to look at the ancient DNA captured in the soils around in the lake bed sediments and also on the site itself. And through that, we're hoping we may be able to determine what kind of animals were being kept around there and eaten, and all sorts of things, the kind of cereal grains that were being grown and that sort of thing. So there's lots of, when you push what you can actually say from this evidence, you can find out a lot more than you might think originally possible from very small ephemeral archaeological remains. So on one of the main Neolithic crannog that we've been working at in Loch Borgestell, because we've spent several years digging there, we've got a good idea of the kind of thing that might have been going on. So originally people were living in what is now quite a harsh bog-dominated landscape. It may have been a bit more treey then, and we don't know very much about that kind of houses that they were living in, but whatever they did, they were also building large Neolithic tombs to bury their dead. And one of the other things that they invested their energy into was building artificial islands in lakes or lochs. And they initially did this by floating lots of large logs out and creating a platform on that basis, maybe weighed down by stones. And what they ultimately seem to have done is go out every now and again onto these platforms and potentially have big ceremonies or feasts that involved eating food, living there maybe for a few days, and ultimately throwing the pots into the lake around the site as a kind of closure event to mark the end of that particular festival or whatever it is they were up to. In those pots they're eating a kind of porridge, and in the highly decorated jars they were often eating a kind of meat stew which they didn't eat on other kinds of sites. So they maybe were reserving special food for these ceremonies or festivals that they had on crannogs. And we can only really speculate the other kind of activities that they got up to, but they might have involved all sorts of things involving singing and dancing and that, as well as feasting, with maybe up to 20 or 30 people at a guess, judging by the size of the site. So it's been really fascinating to find out a little bit more about that, and to speculate a little bit about what they might have got up to on those sites. Another place that I've worked with Fraser Sturt is the Isles of Scilly, and we dug a really interesting early Neolithic settlement there, which contained post holes from buildings and pits and lots of pottery and worked flint. One of the fascinating things about that site was that it seemed to be the first substantial settlement that anyone has actually found on the Isles of Scilly, which are around 28 miles off the coast of southwest England, Cornwall. And we suggested that perhaps people were visiting the islands, not living there necessarily all the time, but visiting them possibly to collect the available flint that was there, and they may have actually done that sea crossing because they needed that flint. I've worked a lot on islands, and obviously there are a lot of islands around Britain, and I've come to realise that it's not just me that's fascinated with islands, but people in the prehistoric and more recent past as well. It's amazing to think some of the places that people ventured out to. There's Neolithic pottery on St Kilda, so right out into the Atlantic Ocean beyond the Outer Hebrides. And then of course there's lots of early medieval settlement on all sorts of different islands, where sometimes monastic settlements were, and that kind of thing. And as I've discussed with crannogs, people were making their own islands within an island setting. So there's definitely something conceptually important about islands, and the fascination with getting out to them and then subsequently occupying them has been a very long-lasting phenomena that people have participated in and enjoyed for millennia, basically. And that remains one of the enduring fascinations with island life. With Stonehenge, the monument itself, a site that I've done lots of work around, but never actually particularly on the main site. But it's important to understand that site and all of the attractions that brought people to it in the first place. Probably when you're thinking about what Stonehenge was used for, probably the main thing to bear in mind is that it transformed its use over the years, which is probably why it was such a successful site. So possibly it was built in the first place because of some geological alignments that line up. So these are geological features created in the Ice Age that line up on the solstice alignment that's echoed in the monument now, and maybe the reason why the first henge monument was built in that place, because people had noticed this natural feature that was on the solstice alignment. So they create a monument to kind of echo that, and it echoes and it reflects the movement of the celestial bodies, which would have been very important in terms of understanding the seasons, and seems to have been a way that people thought about their world and their religion. Then, interestingly, beyond that early monument, Stonehenge then got used as a burial ground. It contained dozens of cremation burials buried in pits around the monument, probably for several centuries. Around that time, the monument was used in conjunction with Durrington Walls, just a few kilometres away, and that seems to have been more of a kind of place for the living, a settlement where people lived maybe seasonally and had big feasts, consumed large amounts of animals, came from long distances away, did all their partying there, and then maybe made a special journey or pilgrimage along the river to Stonehenge, potentially to bury or commemorate the dead at the monument. After that phase, the various stones got brought in, including the famous blue stones, which came all the way from southwest Wales, and then, of course, the enormous sarsen that make the monument so distinctive today. Again, Stonehenge remains a mystery because no one really knows exactly what went on. But certainly we can imagine that particular people were allowed access into the monument to conduct ceremonies, especially at the winter and the summer solstice, but probably at different points in the year as well. Maybe only certain people were allowed in the middle, and other people could watch from around the monument, reflecting distinctions of religious importance and that kind of thing. And then as that era came to an end, and the kind of ceremonies that people did in the very end of the Neolithic and into the Chalcolithic and the beginning of the Copper and then Bronze Age, the Stonehenge itself seems to have gone out of focus as a place for religious observance, at least to some extent, but it curiously remained a focus in the landscape. So people carried on or took up the idea of burying the dead in that landscape, but not in Stonehenge so much itself, but in barrows or burial mounds all around, where and for the kilometres around what we know as Stonehenge now, has amongst the most dense concentration of burial mounds that we know in Britain, and sometimes containing really amazing treasures of gold and amber and beautiful pots and things like that. So while Stonehenge faded from view, it was also still in people's minds as they buried well into the Bronze Age and beyond.
The story of Britain's later prehistory culminates in a tapestry of innovation, identity, and exchange that set the stage for the transformative centuries to follow. Over 8 centuries, communities across the islands mastered the forging of bronze and later iron, harnessing these materials not only to craft tools and weapons but also to articulate their social standing through elaborate metalwork and ornament. As regional styles in pottery, architecture, and burial rites flourished, so too did networks of trade and communication, linking coastal producers of tin and copper with craftsmen and chieftains in distant inland territories. The rise of hill forts, fortified enclosures that ranged from modest homesteads to sprawling tribal capitals, attests to the growing complexity of social hierarchies, as emerging elites asserted their power through monumental earthworks and controlled resources on a landscape still largely governed by kinship ties and seasonal rhythms. By the 1st century BC, the arrival of Mediterranean influences, coinage stamped with classical imagery, fine Gallo-Belgic pottery, and imported wine and oil, offered new symbols of status and sparked fresh currents of innovation. Though the record is silent on the rituals of native priesthoods, the impressions left by votive deposits, ritual ditches, and sacred springs hint at a spiritual world as dynamic and interconnected as its material culture. These evolving traditions, rooted in local practice yet open to external inspiration, created a robust cultural framework that would both resist and adapt to the seismic impact of the Roman conquest in AD 43. Ultimately, Britain's later prehistory stands as a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of its early inhabitants. Through the lenses of archaeology and anthropology, we glimpse a society adept at forging new technologies, negotiating identities, and weaving alliances across both terrestrial and maritime highways. The monumental landscapes, earthwork cemeteries, and rich hoards of metalwork left behind testify to a vibrant era of creativity and exchange. As the curtain rose on Roman Britain, the precedents established by Bronze and Iron Age communities ensured that the island's cultural foundations remained both deep-rooted and remarkably adaptable.